Okay, welcome. Hi, I'm Bruce Ross from T2 Computing here in New York, and we're hosting a live panel today for live streaming. And a little bit about myself. I've been in the broadcast industry since the late 90s and a number of systems integrators. And in the past several years, everything has gone live streaming, everything's gone VOD. So basically, we've been asked to put together this panel today to talk about live and some of the technical issues around live. And so I would like to introduce the esteemed panel today. Alan Broome, who is the Vice President of IP Video Engineering at Comcast Viper.
Hi. I lead the Viper team. We're out of Denver, Colorado, and we basically design and build the core video platform, or the core IP video platform for Comcast. You know, that powers our mobile devices, set-top boxes, connected TVs. You know, this is everything from source acquisition, transcoding, packaging, encryption, down through delivery and the players that we put on these devices. Along with all the supporting feature functionality like blackouts, ad insertion, big data analytics, and cloud DVR services.
Okay, and also we have Diane Strutner, who's the VP of Sales and Business Development at Nice People at Work, involved in analytics.
Hi, everyone. So yes, we are a big data and video analytics company. We work with anybody that streams video over the internet. And we primarily work with QoS metrics, which I like to call problem identifying metrics, and QoE metrics, which are really user preferential metrics. We work with telcos, broadcasters, and media groups in general. And we get a large source of data around the video that our customers are streaming, and we provide them insights and information on how to improve the user experience, what's working, what's not working. Our strength is processing large amounts of data in real time, and then they can obviously use this to improve their live streaming strategies. So.
Thank you. And we have John Alexander, who is Senior Director of Product Management from Level 3 Communications. John?
Cool, thank you. So Level 3 Communications is a global telecommunications company. At Level 3, I run the media products. So that's two key areas for us. It's our Vivux broadcast video contribution and distribution service. We deliver about 20,000 minutes of broadcast video every month. And I run our content delivery network products as well. So we work with a lot of video, software, gaming, and web companies delivering content over the internet.
Thank you. And we have Omer Luzzatti from Yahoo, who is the Senior Director, Head of Video Products.
Thank you, Brian. You all know Yahoo. We focused in the last several years on live streaming as well as our bread and butter, which is VOD. For live, we, as you all know, broadcasted NFL in last October, which was the biggest ever OTT event in the US. It was the first time that an event such as the NFL is going live out there without the backup of a TV other than in market for the teams themselves. So, and that was massive. It was a huge event. In addition to that, today we broadcast MLB, NHL on a daily basis. VOD, however, is much bigger for Yahoo than live still. We have Tumblr, we have Flickr, and mainly we have all the Yahoo properties that Yahoo News, Yahoo Finance, Yahoo.com, with millions and millions of viewers a day.
Thank you. So we know that when the button works, live streaming content is everywhere now, and it's just growing in importance. Video on demand had been, very important, but live streaming I think is getting more so, especially with live sports, the leagues, Major League Baseball, NFL, soccer, NBA, television sports and college sports, live news coverage, very important. News organizations have breaking news, and local is very important for live content. Live music and concerts, the recent Coachella concert that was broadcast on YouTube, live events, award shows, social, and even user-generated content. And there's been a lot of discussion about Facebook and Twitter here at the show and the platforms there. Internet of Things is now beginning to stream video, and linear streaming, which is a special case. So I'd like to ask the panelists if there are any general comments about that. And Alan, do you have any general comments about current technologies?
I think to us, live streaming and linear streaming, is relatively the same. For us, we operate about 11,000 broadcast linear channels today, 24/7. They're all live. They carry live events, syndicated content. Linear is definitely a different beast than VOD, and there's a lot of complexities with delivering linear streaming that you just don't run into with an on-demand session.
Okay, in terms of analytics, what are some of the issues that you see with live streaming different than, say, video on demand?
I think it's important to do the differentiation between the two different types of content, and later on we'll kind of go into some of the results we've seen from differentiating between live and VOD, but in terms of user preference and their tolerance levels, you can see that it varies greatly.
Okay, that's great. And John, what are your thoughts on this?
We've certainly seen a very rapid increase in the amount of linear streaming that we've seen probably over the last 12 months. I think a lot of that has been driven by some more flexible rights negotiations, which has allowed some new services to be created that weren't necessarily feasible before. I think the linear channels over the internet are certainly a huge trend that we're seeing, and expect a lot more of that later on in the year.
That's great. And Omer, any thoughts on from Yahoo's point of view?
Yeah, first of all, we see the content owners being ready to open their agreements and to discuss linear streaming over the internet. And that's the major factor here, because content for the big masses comes from these content owners. What we have seen in the last years as well is more UGC, user-generated content, going live. There were several startups in the last years trying to do something, but until I believe Twitter and now Facebook and YouTube obviously getting into the game, now it becomes much more relevant and big. In terms of the live streaming itself, in terms of technology, I think we can differentiate between at least three types. One is there is real-time communication, Google Hangout, Skype, right? The delays there must be around 200 milliseconds, nothing more than that. Mm-hmm. Then there are these UGC, the Facebook, that try to bring the content to the audience in something like amount of 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, but because of the communication, it needs to be relatively fast, but it does not need to be as fast as real-time communication. And then there is the huge distribution of MLB that can get, or the linear that can get even to the 20, 30 seconds in terms of delay.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go on to the next, and certainly there are a lot of technical issues with streaming, and all of us are involved in essentially in an ecosystem that has a lot of moving parts, a lot of players, and how the players all work together and interrelate is really you need to have a scorecard. So we put together a scorecard here of the providers, social, between broadcast, cable, and then the various platforms. And certainly, I don't think any particular live stream can occur in a vacuum. It's basically with a number of partners involved. Second area would be, what are some of the challenges that we're running into right now? And one area would be live source acquisition, and certainly, Alan, you probably have a lot of issues around that.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing there for us is, we used to do most of our sourcing over satellite. We're migrating most of that towards direct fiber. A lot of that is, around getting closer to the source, getting mezzanine feeds, because you always want to improve video quality. And, the quicker you can pick it up and, the better source that you can get, the better quality you can get. Then tying into sources is, like failover. Are you running geographic redundant, facilities? So I think that leads into a lot of these other areas.
Right, and so then when we look at packaging and processing and the ad insertion, encoding and encryption, that's pretty much the area that you're working in, right?
Yeah, because we're doing broadcast television, we do dynamic ad insertion. So we'll take broadcast feeds that may have a baked-in national advertisement, and then in different regions, we replace that national ad with localized ads. And doing that on a live stream, where you've got in-band signaling that's telling you maybe 4 seconds ahead of the ad break, is a nice problem to solve. Doing that frame accurately so that you're not getting blips of the underlying ad, is a lot of fun. You're doing it with HLS, through manifest manipulation. Your ads may not match, bit rates, of the source content. You may not have the same audio codecs in the ad. If you're doing surround sound for a show, and then you've got an ad that's only available with stereo. There's a lot of complexity in doing this, and if you don't own sort of the end-to-end solution, it's hard to make this work seamlessly.
Excellent. And in terms of delivery on the CDN, I'd like to bring it over to John and ask about CDN to the origin server, and then the latency and the last mile issues that you may run into.
Yes, I mean, it's definitely I'll use Alan's comment. It's an interesting challenge to deal with. I mean, and so really what we're seeing is that convergence of a broadcast experience that we're trying to replicate over an unreliable delivery mechanism on the internet, and trying to get as close to that traditional experience that we've all grown up with and used for many, many years is difficult. And so the way that we manage the communications over the internet, the way we select which CDN servers to deliver content from, the way we measure that performance is already key to delivering a good experience there. And so I think a lot of this comes back to the data that we collect, the telemetry that we have on the system, and that real-time signaling to identify where there are issues, potential, or actually occurring at the time, and then how we decide to route around and avoid those. I think that's the core of the challenge that we're solving for.
Great. And one of the areas I think that, Omer, you probably run into quite a bit are the multitude of devices that are out there. So you've got mobile devices, you've got in-home, you've got old, new, and so on. Do you have to calculate that into your operations?
Oh yeah, certainly. The multiple devices, there are several problems with that. You need to develop your application for the devices themselves. If you want to leverage your own algorithms that enables you to deliver better quality to the end user, such as your own adaptive bitrate algorithm, then necessarily you need a piece of code within the devices that requires knowledge, that requires a team of developers for the iOS, for the Android, and so on and so forth. In terms of delivery itself, one of the interesting things that we have learned is that devices, some CDNs prefer or deliver better to certain devices than others. Then there are issues of things that you want to achieve, for example, 60 frames per second. That is something that is not supported on all devices. If you need to create now different manifests, different group of streams, different HLS streams for every type of device, then you actually do need some kind of a policy server that will enable to create a manifest, create a specific set of streams to different devices. That's, again, another complexity, another piece to the equation. So definitely, that variation is problematic as well.
Yeah, John. And how do you see that?
Diane?
Okay, Diane, okay.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to point back to ad insertion that, from the analytics perspective, we see all of these different parts of the delivery as being variables. So if you bring ads in, if an ad's failing, then that interrupts the experience. So being able to capture all of those metrics are really important. And going back to balancing between CDNs, being able to take real-time decisions on which CDNs are performing and which are not, being able to change that delivery path, as we'll kind of see later, has huge benefits when it comes to live streaming in terms of better engaging the audience in terms of playtime. In terms of devices, the same thing. If you identify that specific devices or protocols or geographies are served better with specific CDNs, being able to have the tools to switch that delivery path around will allow you guys to deliver a better overall experience for your audience base.
Cool. As far as based on the ad insertion and getting your analytics back, then do you see that there are any differences between VOD and live streaming in terms of that?
In terms of ad insertion?
Yeah, in terms of how the analytics come back on ad insertion.
I think it would depend upon the way that the ad is inserted. I think when you do dynamic ad insertion, there's probably more variables to the whole equation. But compared to server side where that risk is reduced, but then you don't have the advantage of the real time where you could maybe ask for higher CPMs or do more specific ad delivery with real-time ad insertion. So I guess when it comes to ads, you might see that when you're doing real-time ad insertion, a specific ad asset might be failing, and then having that real-time information to pull that out of the funnel and put something else in there is important.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, in terms of, I think that leads us into sort of the network operations support, right? There's this whole concept of putting together the teams for network operations when you're doing a live stream where you've got the encoding people, the CDN, people doing our analytics, and so it's a whole proactive process. And that all has to work, and time to make to fix an error or fix a problem is very short. So how do you handle that, John, in your work?
I think it comes down to preparation. A good example is we've acquired the Super Bowl for 27 years. We've worked with the host broadcaster every year and worked with the NFL on that. And so the production and preparation that goes into an event like the Super Bowl is substantial. On the broadcast world, that industry has developed a very good practice around supporting these types of events that can't afford to fail. On the internet, for some of this over-the-top streaming, the maturity isn't necessarily there. So Level 3 acquired a company back in 2007 in Dublin, and those guys did a lot of streaming of live events. They did a lot of earnings calls and corporate events, as well as sporting events. But the way those events were being produced at that time was a PC running a capture card with a bit of software running on it, and the number of issues down to just the hardware, the kind of the on-site capture were multitudes of them. And so I think we have developed in the interim 10 years around the processes and trying to bring across the expertise that we have from that broadcast side and match that up to the experience that we're looking for across the internet. And I think it comes back to that concept of we're trying to replicate that broadcast experience now. The events of the scale that Omer was talking about, are huge. The amount of money now being spent on acquiring rights and the size of the audience, the potential to monetize that, deserves that same level of professionalism and preparation.
That's great. That's great. And
Yeah, I just
Diane.
want to say on the analytics side, preparation is huge. I think the more information you can capture, the better. So if you take an example, let's see you're streaming an event, you see buffer ratio go up to 5%. All right, well, it's good to know, but how are you going to actually fix any of those issues? If you can filter that by CDN or by ISP or by device, it becomes infinitely more useful. If you can then cross that over to various different dimensions and segment that data down to the exact root of the issue, then you've saved more time and resources. So in terms of the analytics, the more data that you can capture, the better. And also, I guess once you've done, and there's some things you'll be able to change to have a direct impact during that event, and other things you should just learn for next time. So being able to go back and look at what happened before and comparing statistics between last year's event and this event and what went well and what didn't go well, which providers performed, which didn't. You can do that well if you set ahead of time the right types of information to be passed and captured and stored inside your analytics.
okay, you made a point about CDN switching, and sometimes it's a good thing to do and sometimes it's a bad thing to do. Any comments on that?
Yeah, maybe we can go into some of the...
Into the slides, okay.
Yeah.
All right,
That's
so
right,
why don't we hold that off
We'll
until
hold on, yeah.
we get to that point?
Yeah.
And one of the other things that, Alan, you had mentioned was synchronization between the various streams, because if you're in a bar and there's one TV that's sort of off by 10 seconds, how do you handle that?
Yeah, I think most everybody today is doing adaptive multi-bit rate streaming, which we all know is client driven, and so synchronizing clients is an interesting problem. There's definitely ways to do it, but it's a lot more difficult than when you're delivering a broadcast or a multicast video feed. So having common clock and figuring out how to have players drop frames or speed up playback so that you can gradually converge on a common playback point is something that's required if you're going to go into a sports bar or some facility where you've got maybe a sports venue like a stadium, and you've got lots of TVs showing the same content.
Excellent. And just in terms of if we look at football carried on Yahoo versus what we get over the air, right? So there are some timing issues, and one of the original discussion points that we talked about was this whole latency thing, and how can we ameliorate latency somewhat in the system? I mean, there are so many moving parts, but that's one of the areas that we should be trying to focus on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we trade, and what's the reason for latency? Currently, the main technical reason for latency is because of the decision to go with HTTP as a base protocol for streaming, whether it's HLS or Dash. In HLS, for example, you have 10 seconds for each segment or 8 seconds. And you need to aggregate 3 of those. So your delay, you start from a 24 seconds delay from the original stream that you get. Over television, it's around 2 to 4 seconds over satellite or what have you. And then there are regulations about some delays that need to be there. So what can be done, and how do we see the technology going forward? So is there a question? Is there a problem there? What is the real problem? Is the real problem the fact that I'm watching the game and I'm hearing my neighbors yelling that there was a goal? Or is the problem something, synchronization between the viewers themselves? So one of the problems that we have seen was the tweeting of the results over Twitter. So you get the results, many people are watching their mobile device, they see the result, that the goal happened, and now they need to wait for 30 seconds. So we try to overcome that problem as well. We're working on additional protocols, UDP protocols, protocols that are not necessarily HTTP, lowering the segment to 2 seconds in terms instead of 8 seconds. All these are done in order to try and to solve the latency problem.
That's great.
Comment that we've done the same thing. So we're actually running 2-second fragments with HLS, but 2-second fragments introduces new problems for you too. So the shorter your fragment, the more HTTP requests that you're making. So that's a different scaling problem for the CDNs to solve. And then if you go to demuxed audio, so your audio and video tracks are separate, now you've doubled your transactional load again. So there's definitely pros and cons of all these mitigations around latency.
John, are you seeing the same kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly the same issue as Alan was talking about there. So as we see the chunk size reduced, the transactional overhead with all the manifests and different renditions goes up dramatically. The demuxed audio, you end up with very small audio fragments being delivered every 2 seconds, which is a different I/O problem on the CDN servers themselves, different from relatively large video segments. I think going back to Omer's point, I think if you look at the workflow end to end, there's multiple places where latency is introduced, and so the general rule of thumb we have is that anytime you touch the video, you're going to introduce latency. So on the broadcast signal acquisition side, we're increasingly moving towards uncompressed feeds coming out of venues, or very lightly compressed feeds. So very high bandwidth coming out, so a very high quality feed, and so the minimal amount of processing that's happening to that feed means we can get it to the broadcaster with less delay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings up a good question too, because sometimes the broadcasters will be most often providing a medium resolution or high resolution content, but we're starting to see more and more 4K originate. Is that something that anyone is starting to see in practice at this point, or is it still off in the future?
So I would say for linear, I think that's off in the future. We're seeing more 4K capture, but for the playout, that's a more compressed feed that's coming through. So at a sporting event, there's often 4K capture going on, but then that 4K content is sent back through file-based workflows for other purposes later. It's not necessarily the broadcast feed that's played out.
Right. Yeah, we're seeing some VOD workflows that are happening with 4K with Netflix and so on.
I think just a quick comment on that.
Yeah.
A lot of the testing and stuff that we've done is until you get to screens over about 85 inches, the average consumer can't really tell the difference in HD content and 4K content. And what we're seeing that's going to have a much bigger impact, from a quality perspective, is high dynamic range. And that's something that we're pursuing pretty heavily.
Really, it's interesting about high dynamic range because that it gives a much more lifelike and realistic view. And the question is, can compression keep up with HDR and so on? Can it portray it? And what kind of experiences have you had with that?
We're having good success with it. I think we're going to be having some HDR content out fairly soon.
Nice to know about that. Just not to change subjects, but certainly the government is part of our lives with live and with linear. And in terms of emergency alerts, closed captioning, and all that, does that pose a special problem for live?
From our perspective, we treat all of our content the same. So whether it's over the top, if it's broadcast television, we try to be in compliance. We deliver emergency alerts. We deliver closed captioning, secondary audio, descriptive video services. If it's available in the source content to us, we make it available to our consumers on all of their consumption devices. Emergency alerts is an interesting problem. If you're not familiar with it, You know, a lot of emergency alerts today are delivered over radio. So, you know, we have thousands of receivers, you know, spread across the nation, and, you know, they're picking up these radio alerts and converting them into, you know, an IP message that we deliver. So that was a really interesting problem.
Yeah, closed caption definitely is part of the requirements, at least that we know of, and we are mandated to, you know, to provide it in multiple languages and so on. These notifications, not yet. I hope that not starting today, we'll have to start to, yeah, to follow that as well.
Okay, that sounds great. Now, certainly, we were talking a little bit about synchronization before in terms of the signals. And if you get metadata feeds in from, say, third parties, how do you coordinate that, and how do you make sure that it's synchronized with the live video?
It very much depends. If it's part of some kind of an original stream that has a timestamp on it, then it could be done. If it's something like the scores or statistics about players, then we need to delay those type of data feeds and to try to sync them with the player itself.
Okay. All right. Well, we've hit a lot of topics so far, and I wanted to introduce Diane's got some real live results from the field. She had spent quite a bit of time in Europe with live broadcasters and streaming with the European Broadcasting Union, and has a set of slides that she'd like to present. And if you don't mind, I can click through and.
Please do.
All right. So this is the intro.
Yeah, so basically this comes from a presentation we did at the European Broadcasting Union a few weeks ago. I just want to quickly explain what we do so you'll understand what the stats are. So basically, we provide plugins, or people can use their own beacons or plugins to capture information from the player side. We bring that information into our platform and then create real-time metrics around that information with a 1-minute granularity to see inside the dashboard. And then we enable customers to gather insights and you know, understand better their audience experience, either through the interface itself or through APIs, and then take actions based upon the information that they're gathering. So.
Okay.
So yeah, there's different challenges that we see. So planning ahead, like I talked about before, making sure that you're capturing all the information. We actually take kind of like a screenshot of all the metadata from every single stream. So we can go back and if you hadn't, for example, set a filter before, and then maybe you didn't know to set a filter, and then you're trying to diagnose an issue, you can go back and backtrack that issue, making the information actionable, knowing how to use the data, so there's information that'll be useful internally. And in the moment, there's information that you might want to pass to some of your vendors, like the CDN. And then there's things that you should have as takeaways for next time. Some of these are a little screwed. So, yeah, we're good. So basically, we did a study with European broadcasters that were doing live streams, 6 customers, a lot of data points that were analyzed. And what we found was, well, so here's some general KPIs that we are tracking. So for example, buffer ratio, interruptions, which is the frequency of buffering events, play failures, exits before video starts. That's kind of an experience metric. So that's where the users decided to leave the stream before they've reached the first frame, time to first frame. So we want to specifically drill down into buffer ratio. Mm-hmm. And
okay.
so what we were looking at here for buffer was that, I think we're missing some text here, but it looks like, I believe that what we saw was that there was an additional 24 minutes that was added to the playtime if buffer ratio was reduced by 0.2%. So it's a huge impact on the playtime, which directly affects the business in terms of the experience for the user, the ads that get delivered, so on and so forth.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah. So, and we also looked at how the effect, everybody's been talking about CDN switching, is it really worth it, is it not? And we specifically looked at it from the perspective of delivering live streams, and we found that, first of all, when you look at the network, and that includes things like the CDN, the ISP, and the environment inside the home, it's only performing optimally about 30% of the time. So if you can control some of that variability and move that more towards 70% from things that you can't control, like maybe CDN delivery, then you can produce a better experience for all of your users. So moving into the next slide.
Okay.
So yeah, this is some of the statistics that we gathered. So this is the percentile of the users. So we scored the networks from a scale from 1 to 10. You can see that a lot did pretty well, but then again, there was still 70% that stayed way out of range, that were in average or poor performance.
Well, and one of the points you made was that there was an average, on average, people got a pretty good performance, but you could get poor performance or excellent performance, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was only performing optimally 30% of the time.
Wow.
So one of the ways that you can optimize the performance is to, again, there's things you can control, there's things that you can't. One of the things that you can control would be the CDN delivery. So being able to switch out the CDN over what makes the most sense for your business. So we offer a few different ways of being able to redirect CDN traffic. One is looking at quality metrics like play failures, buffer ratio, interruptions, and looking at real-time information around the time of day and the device and the location of the user streaming that content, and providing back a scored list of CDNs to deliver that content. So that's, if you, for example, are working on a subscription basis, that could be the most important is the user experience. If you're doing ad delivery, maybe you're also concerned about how much you're paying. So maybe you see that, and the best CDN is performing at 0.5% buffer ratio. The next best CDN is 1% buffer ratio, so it's twice as bad. However, it's 4 times cheaper, and how much are you going to get on the ad delivery? So you could program it to say, let's switch out, if as long as I stay below 1%, because I don't really see much effect on my audience engagement in terms of playtime below 1%, let's switch over the CDN that's costing me the least for this delivery so I maximize the business side of this. And what we're seeing here is specifically in live stream traffic. So what this shows is anything that goes above 0 is the impact of where the plays have been moved to. And what goes below 0 is all of the streams that have been switched out of different buffer ratio segments and moved into positive. So what we see is that we took away a lot of streams that would have had buffer ratio above 20%, and we've moved them over to plays that had a buffer ratio maybe of 0.2 to 0.2%. So this will obviously have a huge impact on the experience that your users have. And actually, if we go to the next slide, which will cover playtime, we can actually see that the playtime will shift, and they'll play much more if we've been able to switch out the CDNs to accommodate for the quality metrics that we're looking at. So that was it.
Okay, thanks. So in terms of the analysis that you did,
Yeah.
how did the panelists respond to that? What's your thought on that?
Switching CDN is important. We, for the NFL game, had around 26 optimization and switching CDNs, the percentages of CDNs. The only addition to what Diane said is when to switch CDN and who is originating the request to the player to switch CDN. So A is a group of newcomers. So let's say that now I'm serving 8 million concurrent viewers, but I decide that in Australia I'm going to switch CDN. Now the new users in Australia will start to use the new CDN. B is whenever the viewers had serious problems, such as recovery and buffering, now the player itself will ask to which CDN to go. That's option B. And option C is actually the server seeing a problem, asking actively the players to switch CDN, which is much more complex actually to achieve and to do.
Okay, John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, so it's just interesting. So, I mean, generally, we love more data. The more data we have around where there are issues allows us to optimize and improve the experience. And so, more transparency around real-world performance is great for us. We spend a lot of time developing internal tools, so we understand where we're doing a good job and where we need to improve. So that's good. I mean, I think one of the key challenges with switching is being certain that making a decision to move a portion or all of the traffic is actually going to improve the situation. Certainly for the very largest event, I think the piece that's sometimes lost is that the amount of traffic that we're talking about significantly shifts traffic inside network operators, and it's a meaningful amount of traffic, and it can generate so much load that you can actually cause more problems, not only within the last mile networks and on the CDN platform, but also on the upstream infrastructure. The problem that we see most often is actually upstream of the CDN itself and the origin infrastructure where we're receiving the content from. Where that origin infrastructure starts to see issues, those cascade down through the CDN. Switching to another CDN, if it's not fully warmed, if it doesn't have the right shielding infrastructure in place, can actually put more load back on the origin. Certainly if you've got two CDNs now filling from the origin. And you can end up in a much worse situation where you end up impacting the origin, making the situation worse, and then impacting all users. So I think the data is great. Understanding where you have problems is really important. But the decision-making around how you improve the situation is where I still think there's a lot of art, and we need more science and more repeatable processes around how to fully optimize that experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, from the data we've shared here, this is considering that every single request that's come in has had a unique set of, a unique CDN list given back to the player to go fetch the information. So if you're deciding to switch everything over from one to the other, you might just be literally passing the hot potato to someone else to take care of, right? But if you're able to do it on a more granular, segmented basis, and for the sake of user experience on a one-to-one basis, then I think that's really the ideal scenario there. And it's, a lot of CDNs are, now that the data is out there, they're much more willing to look at the data, and they want to improve the services. But I think that, they run into the same issues that you do when something's not working and customers are complaining. If you don't have the information, you can't take any decisions to improve the process, and they would like to. So tools that are capturing information, when we're sitting at the end of the value chain in terms of what actually the users see, but there's analytics in all parts of the delivery system, and the ideal scenario is that you kind of marry everything together and you see the impact of each one as they go through the chain. And I think that cooperations like analytics companies like ours working together with CDN companies to exchange this information and help you guys improve your services, and working with other types of analytics companies to see the impact of the data further on down the stream is what's going to help carry the overall experience to being something more like linear quality experience.
Excellent. And Alan, with Comcast kind of having the encoding, the transport, and the last mile, do you run into those kinds of issues as well?
I would say we don't do CDN switching, but we also aren't doing live events. So our usage is fairly consistent, and so we build out capacity. We do have peaks where we have, we call it watchathon, where we give away, premium content for free for like a weekend. And so we'll see maybe 4 times our normal traffic, but we build out for those peaks. Mm-hmm. And it definitely helps, owning the network, the CDN, and all of the delivery components in that path.
Yeah. And certainly one thing about live is that it's very unpredictable. And so everyone's got a war story, I'm sure, about something that's happened to them. And certainly, any comments on that? A couple of war stories from
I've seen the blood in the numbers sometimes where we're monitoring an event for someone, like a live sporting event, and you'll just start to see play failures peak. And you're like, oh shoot, I don't know what to do. And so we'll call the provider and we'll call the CDN and get them talking. But I think this comes down to being prepared and making sure that you're monitoring everything and that all the providers that you're using are all in sync to avoid as much bloodshed as possible, I guess. in that
Sure.
sense.
Yeah, sure. John, any stories along those lines?
Well, I mean, my lots, but I mean, none that we can share. But I mean, my biggest, I guess, frustration in this space is the lack of data. So more data, making better informed decisions is really important. So where it's most frustrating for us is where customers overreact based on one or two tweets on Twitter, and they think the sky's falling down based on the experience of one or two individual users who are very vocal around the problems. I think better metrics, better understanding of real end user experience is going to help us mature and improve the experience for all users rather than the reacting to the outliers.
Yeah, that's great. And Omer, any thoughts on that?
For example, again, the NFL, we had a fiber cut. There was a storm in Dallas, and you can't do much about that one. Luckily, we had the recovery mechanism on the player, so viewers did hit buffering for 10 seconds. Now we knew about it, so CDN was switched from the CDN that had this fiber cut to other CDN, and it was solved.
Yeah, so it's always unpredictable. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone, and I'd like to open the floor to questions, if there are any questions for our panels. And is there a microphone?
I think you have to repeat the questions that they asked.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
So this question is probably for Omer and Alan, just from the perspective of the business. But the question is this: with linear playback and live events, one of the interesting things is advertisement, right? And as events become more and more popular, like Super Bowl, and people want, such as advertisers, want dynamic ad insertion, which are specific to each user group. You're talking about unique insertions at really large scale. How do you guys handle for those kind of cases?
So the
What are you guys
questions are.
thinking there?
The questions around ad insertion, scale, and handling unique as the value goes up. How do we handle that?
So we didn't want to take any risks for the NFL game. Basically, what we did was ad stitching on the server side. The sell deals, and luckily Yahoo, as a sales team, they closed deals with the big advertisers, Toyota, Walmart, and others. Obviously, we have also dynamic ad insertion on the player, and what you mentioned is definitely a big problem. We see higher buffering, we see scaling issues with those aspects. What we are writing on and what we're working on and planning to do is to have more intelligent ad switching on the server side that will enable at least to segment these millions to 100 or 200 groups, and then to have a type of server ad stitching that will answer also a more targeted advertisement needs.
Okay. Another question?
I have a scaling question, so probably to Omer and Alan again. Omer, you mentioned that with the NFL, you guys did that game online except in the local markets where it was still available on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have a sense of, had it been 100% only available via an IP platform, what those numbers would have looked like? And would the world have been able to handle that? And I guess, Alan, similar question to you. If tomorrow they turned off the QAM network to Comcast, what happens, and since I kind of know the answer a little bit, how much work, in rough percentages, do you guys have to do to really be able to support that world that everybody expects is coming?
Yeah, so for us at least, with linear, we have on average, people watching 5 hours of TV a day, and millions of people watching, tens of millions of people watching. But what we're doing for linear, again, coming back to owning the network is, we can leverage multicast. So, we've developed a technology with adaptive multi-bit rate streaming where we can actually multicast the different profiles and bit rates over our access network, so that we're transmitting the content one time to everybody that's downstream on the network, versus it being a unicast session like's done today, where if you've got 1,000 users watching the channel, you're delivering the content 1,000 times. With multicast, you deliver it one time, and it's fanned out to all 1,000 users. So we have that technology. We're running that in trials today at multiple regions, and believe it's ready.
Yes. So the in-market, adding the in-market wouldn't affect us that much. We know the numbers of the in-market and the numbers that we had. But that was a Sunday game, a typical game with, let's say, on average on TV, 10 million concurrent. What if you want to support more than that, or many more than that? And there is a problem. And one of the solutions is indeed to work with the ISPs and to utilize their own internal networks, such as the multicast network, to have them a gateway receiving that HLS stream and then handling it to them to be able to bring it to the users in a better quality over multicast. And there are other techniques, and also the infrastructure itself eventually will get there. Is it possible to stream today to 100 million concurrent in the US? No, probably not.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
No, I just want to say we've seen across different customers of ours, when we look at peering issues, we'll see the same issue appear across different customers. So someone goes back and says, hey, this looks a little odd, and we can compare that to another customer and say, yeah, so we're already starting to see some issues where cooperation, again, I think that's kind of a theme, would help solve a lot of some of these issues.
Okay. Another question?
So Mark Mislinski from Intelsat. This is probably more for John and Alan. I recognize startup latency and that having to do with the actual startup of the stream when somebody says okay. And we often talk about lag, and that's to us the time differential from the point of origin to somebody actually viewing.
Yeah.
Do you find yourselves at all acknowledging lag time drift from like the beginning of the event to the end of the event, and do you measure or monitor for that? The drifting where the lag time would increase over the course of a live event. Like there in the Super Bowl last year for the largest supplier, some of the players, I do understand some of it's player dependent, went from 45 seconds lag to a minute 45 seconds lag. Do you watch for these things? Do you care about those things?
So we definitely see it, and I think it's an artifact of some of the technologies that are being used today for those types of events on the internet. So we see it. It's not necessarily a business challenge for the folks streaming. I think some of the use cases that Alan has described kind of within Comcast, where it's a slightly different use case than NBC's Super Bowl stream over the internet. There's always been a perception that it's good enough, and it's a complement to the broadcast feed. Where we're talking about events that are only available over the internet, then I think we're going to start to get into much more stringent requirements, and things like drift will become important. The synchronization, the example we talked about in a sports bar where you got sort of 3 TVs, you want them to be synchronized, that will become an important problem to solve.
Thank you.
Another question?
Yes, this is I think more for Diane. For delivering globally, how many different CDNs do you see customers using?
I get. So, are you talking about between if someone?
Single customer switching.
Yeah. I think it really depends upon the scope of the audience they're trying to get to and what type of content they're delivering. So if it's VOD, you can more accurately predict some of the peaks, and therefore you can make CDN contracts with maybe 1 or 2 CDNs that might fulfill the need. But I think when we get into some live events, that changes everything. And because it's such a dynamic environment between the CDN and the ISP, and it's very hard to predict, we are seeing that being able to switch between even up to 3 or 4 is what's producing the best results in terms of the customer experience.
Okay, any more questions? One here?
So you guys mentioned that in order to reduce the live latency, you guys are considering probably reducing the keyframe interval. But we have seen that introduce a huge problem of rebuffering. So what is the approach for that issue? Like reducing the keyframe interval to 2 seconds, or segment duration to 2 seconds can introduce rebuffering. So what's the approach for that?
So we definitely don't do it on the fly. We're setting our GOP size, up for a linear channel, but shortening the GOP or where there are iframes, I'm not sure I'm following why that would cause a rebuffering event.
I think okay. So in terms of the keyframe, that can be set to 2 seconds regardless of the segment. The segment affects the latency, the end-to-end delay. And as Alan mentioned before, the segment size, reducing the segment size will bring more load on the CDN in terms of the number of requests. And indeed, for the NFL again, one of the CDN requested that we will not go below 8 seconds segment size, that is already 24 seconds delay. The way to solve it is, scaling on the CDN, being frank about the capacities, having more servers there and more, that's probably the best way to go. There are other protocols that you could consider in terms of, and by doing that, not to have those limitations on the segment size and on the CDN capacity.
Yeah, I did want to mention, in addition to the CDN transaction load, we actually have seen reducing those segments, in the additional load on the client has an impact. And so the client's heuristic engine, because of the extra load of making all these small HTTP transactions, causes the client to rate adapt down to lower bit rates. And we have seen that on low power devices that just can't handle that transaction load.
Those are nuances you'd be able to identify with if you had the right mechanisms to capture the data about the size of the segment and then the nuances between the types of devices that are streaming that content, which would have a direct impact on, all of the encoding and delivery strategy.
Okay, so we have time for about one more question, and if there's anyone who's got something they'd like to bring up. Yes?
Quick question. I was curious about your thoughts when it comes to developing apps specifically for the mobile devices versus, say, leading on HTML5. Is the reason why more and more content creators are using specific apps for, say, Android devices or iOS devices versus HTML5? You follow my question?
So we are moving from Flash to HTML5, and that pretty much across all devices that can support it. In some cases, you simply don't have that support. In some of the TV-connected devices, and as well with iOS, working with the iOS native is the best, probably the best that you can achieve today.
Yeah, I think within the apps, the native interfaces gives you more direct control. HTML5 is great for portability and cross-platform support. But if you really do want to optimize for each individual device, a native app is always going to give you more direct control of the experience.
And is that affordable for smaller content creators?
Probably not. I mean, that's a substantial undertaking. And a lot of that comes down to what devices do you really want to target and focus on. But if you're going to try and build across hundreds of devices, that's a substantial undertaking.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our presenters today. Certainly Alan, Broome, Diane, Strutner, John Alexander, and Omer Luzzatti. Thanks so much for providing us great insights today.